I'm Charlie Sonnier, and this is the 20th Century Hockey Chronicle. As World War I exploded toward a climax on European battlefields, a more dignified war was taking place on ice rinks and in hockey boardrooms. The goal was to establish dominance over the professional game. Lester and Frank Patrick had done so in the West Coast with their Pacific Coast Hockey Association, but a free-for-all of sorts was developing in the East, home of Canada's two largest cities, Toronto and Montreal. Clashes over control of the National Hockey Association grew increasingly fierce, mostly because of one individual, Edward J. Livingstone. Regarded as the George Steinbrenner of his day, Livingstone managed to antagonize every one of his fellow owners. By 1917, they decided they had had enough. But how to get rid of Livingstone? That was the question. Livingstone had been a franchise holder in Toronto and therefore was a legitimate NHA member. The solution of his foes was subtraction by addition. Livingstone was eliminated as an owner simply by the creation of a new league. The coup d'etat was executed in November 1917 during a meeting at the Windsor Hotel in Montreal. All the top pro teams, Ottawa Senators, Quebec Bulldogs, Montreal Canadiens, Montreal Wanderers, and Toronto Arenas were represented. Livingstone, though, was kept from the meeting. When the participants finally emerged from the smoke-filled room, they had created a brand new entity, the National Hockey League, with only Quebec taking a temporary sabbatical. Thus, the new NHL embraced Ottawa, Montreal, Wanderers, and Canadiens, and Toronto. NHA Secretary Frank Calder was named president of the new circuit, and it was off and running. Many of the world's best players graced the new league's rosters. The Wanderers held the immortal Bert Lindsay in goal, and such aces as Sprague and Odie Cleghorn. The Canadiens were led by Joe Malone and Joe Hall, with Newsy Lalonde, the player. Manager, Toronto's best included Reg Noble, Corbett Dennehy, and Harry Meeking, while Ottawa boasted Cy Dennehy, Jack Dara, and Eddie Garrard. Unfortunately, the Wanderers never made it through the season as fire leveled the Montreal Arena on January the 2nd of 1918. Wanderers owner Sam Lichtine attempted to borrow players from other squads, but when they refused to help, he withdrew his club from the NHL. With the three-team league, the NHL barely survived its maiden season. Nevertheless, it did reach the finish line, and the Toronto Arenas became the first NHL club to qualify for Stanley Cup play, hosting a series with Vancouver of the PCHA. 5 games later, the NHL had its first cup winner. Toronto defeated Vancouver 3-2, thanks to the outstanding play of Corbett Dennehy, one of the new league's first stars. The triumph notwithstanding, the NHL still was treading on thin fiscal ice. It now was a question of how long the baby circuit could survive with only 3 teams. The next season, 1918-1919, would hold the answer. When Frank Calder was called upon to lead the new National Hockey League, he was no stranger to First Division hockey. As secretary of the NHA, he was really the rightful heir to their new throne. With delicate maneuvering, he was able to steer the new league through some pretty tough times. In the first year alone, the Quebec franchise decided to suspend operations, and the Montreal Arena burned down, causing the Wanderers to fold. 1917-1918. The National Hockey League is created after squabbling among owners led to the demise of the National Hockey Association. The NHL's first franchises go on to be the Ottawa Senators, Toronto Arenas, Montreal Canadiens, and the Wanderers. On December 19, 1917, the NHL begins its 22-game schedule. The Wanderers' Harry Hyland scores 5 goals on opening night. Joe Malone, former Quebec star, switches to the Canadiens. He registered 3 5-goal games on the year, including 5 on opening night. Joe Malone, the game's first superstar, wins the NHL scoring title with 44 goals in just 20 games. Montreal Arena, home of both the Wanderers and Canadiens, burns down on January 2nd, 1918. Wanderers owner Sam Lichtine pulls his team out of the NHL after only 6 games, with a record of 1-5. The Canadiens decide to continue their season. They'll play in the tiny Jubilee Rink, which seats only 3,250. The NHL adopts a rule allowing goalies to leave their feet. It abolishes the $2 fine previously assessed in the NHA for flopping. Ottawa goalie Clint Benedict is the man who instigates the new flopping rule, since he ignored the old rule so often. The Canadiens, winners of the first half of the season's split schedule, go on to finish 13-9-0. The Arenas, winners of the second half title, finish at 13-9-0 as well. Ottawa finishes third in the standings with a record of 9-13-0. The Arenas defeat Montreal for the NHL title in a 2-game total goal series, 10-7. On March 30th, 1918, the Toronto Arenas become the first NHL team to capture the Stanley Cup. An ironic turn of events, since the Toronto franchise was the last-minute addition to the new league. Led by the steady goaltending of Hap Holmes and the slick scoring skills of Alf Skinner, the Arenas downed PCHA champion Vancouver in a tightly contested 5-game battle. Ottawa's Cy Dennehy finishes second to Joe Malone in regular season scoring with 36 goals. Reg Noble leads Toronto with 28 goals, third in the NHL. Dennehy pots 36 in 22 games, though small in stature. Cy Dennehy of the Ottawa Senators mixed brains and brawn to become one of the NHL's first marksmen. In 1917-18, he netted goals in 12 consecutive games. He finished second in the scoring race with 36 goals in 22 games. Though the Senators finished with a 9-13-0 record, Eddie Garrard and Jack Dara, a holdover from Ottawa's Stanley Cup team of 1911, aided the Ottawa scoring cause. Canadiens goalie George Vezina leads the league in wins with 13 and goals against average of 3.93. Vezina led NHL crease cops with a 3.93 goals against average in 1917. He was nicknamed the Chickatimi Cucumber because of his cool demeanor. Vezina recorded a shutout on February 18th, one of only two the league saw all year. Still, you had to be something special to 10 goal in the NHL in 1917-18, as there were only 3 full-time goalie positions available. Toronto netminder Hap Holmes and Ottawa's Clint Benedict were, like Vezina, future Hall of Famers. The PCHA is reduced to 3 teams, Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland. In a tight PCHA race, Seattle wins the regular season title, edging Vancouver by 2 games. Vancouver's Fred Cyclone Taylor leads the PCHL in goals with 32. Perhaps the most talented player in the PCHA in 1917-18 season was Fred Cyclone Taylor, who led all marksmen with 32 goals in 18 games. The secrets of Taylor's success were his blinding speed, his agility, and his unique hockey stick. The stick featured a curve in the shaft rather than the blade, giving him better maneuverability in stick handling past thick-necked defensemen. Vancouver defeats Seattle 3-2 in a 2-game total goal playoff and will face Toronto in the Stanley Cup. The first 4 games in the Stanley Cup Series are high-scoring affairs. Toronto wins the first and third games 5-3 and 6-3, while Vancouver wins the other 2 games 6-4 and 8-1. On March 30th, 1918, Toronto becomes the first NHL Stanley Cup winner. The Arenas win Game 5 2-1 on a third-period goal by Corbett Dennehy. Malone knocks home 44 or 2.2 per game. When the Canadiens' Joe Malone scored 44 goals in 20 games in 1917-1918, he established a 2.2 goals per game average, the highest per game mark in NHL history. To equal this feat, an 84-game schedule would require a player to score 185 goals. Phantom Joe tallied 5 goals in a game 3 times, victimizing goalies Hap Holmes and Clint Benedict twice. When the NHL launched its second season, bittersweet feelings were sweeping North America. Both Americans and Canadians jubilantly hailed the end of World War I with the armistice on November 1918. But simultaneously, they grew increasingly apprehensive about an influenza epidemic that already had engulfed Europe and now was spreading from Halifax to Victoria. Little did anyone realize that one of its victims would be the 1919 Stanley Cup playoffs and, on a personal note, one of hockey's best players. The Spanish flu was not a main concern when the playoffs began. Seattle had won the Pacific Coast Hockey Association title, eliminating Vancouver in a 2-game total goal series 7-5. NHL champion Montreal took the transcontinental train to Seattle, where the Stanley Cup Finals would take place at the home of the Metropolitans. Playing before a partisan home crowd, the Metropolitans demolished Montreal 7-0 in the opening game, but the Canadiens rebounded in Game 2 with a 4-2 win. Seattle then beat Montreal goalie George Vezina 7 times again in Game 3, winning 7-2. Remarkably, Game 4 ended in a 0-0 tie after 20 minutes of overtime. NHL historian Charles L. Coleman described the contest as the greatest match ever played on the Pacific Coast. Among other highlights, the game featured unusually robust play of Canadiens hitman Joe Hall and Seattle enforcer Cully Wilson. By this time, the series had captured the imagination of all of Canada and Northwest United States. Game 5 provided even more thrills as the Habs rebounded from a 3-goal deficit to even the count 3-3 thanks to 2 goals by Newsy Lalonde and another by Jack McDonald. Everyone in the rink was aware of the worldwide flu epidemic and the fact that there were some objections to such large public gatherings. No less ominous was the behavior of some players who appeared more exhausted than usual. When the game went in overtime, Canadiens forwards Lalonde and Didier Pitre switched to defense and performed admirably in front of goalie Vezina. Finally, at 15:57 of the first sudden death period, Odie Cleghorn beat Seattle goalie Hap Holmes for the winning goal. With the series tied at 2-2-1, the Stanley Cup was up for grabs, but a decision was not forthcoming. Well before the fifth game had ended, Canadian star Joe Hall was rushed to the hospital suffering from the dreaded influenza. In addition, Billy Couture, Jack McDonald, Newsy Lalonde, and Louis Berlinquet also bedridden along with Montreal manager George Kennedy. The latter suggested that the series be continued with Victoria players substituting for the ailing Canadians, but the Metropolitans refused the offer. Other suggestions for the resumption of the series were refused. On April 5, 1919, less than a week after he had dragged his pain-racked body off the ice, Hall died in a Seattle hospital. The 1919 Stanley Cup Finals were canceled, the only time such a development has ever occurred. The year 1919 was a bad year for sports all around. Not only was the World Series blackened by the Black Sox, but the Stanley Cup Finals were canceled because of the influenza epidemic. With the series tied 2-2-1, Game 4 was a 0-0 tie. Players from both Montreal Canadiens and Seattle Metropolitans were hospitalized because of the Spanish flu. Montreal's Joe Hall died from the illness, and no Stanley Cup was awarded. Quebec's franchise fails to state its intentions for the 1918-19 season, and so the NHL remains a three-team league for another year. To speed the game's action, the NHL adds 2 blue lines and permits forward passing between the 2 blue lines. The NHL also institutes new rules prohibiting substitutions for penalized players, 3 minutes for minors, 5 for majors, and no substitution for players assessed match penalties. New statistics are introduced. Assists are tracked along with goals to compose scoring totals. The Canadiens, with a record of 10-8 overall, capture the first half of the regular season title. The Senators, with 7 victories in their last 8 games, win the second half championship. They go 12-6 overall. The defending champ Arenas suffer a sophomore jinx and fall to last place in the standings with a record of 5-13. Montreal's Newsy Lalonde leads the NHL in scoring 21 goals, 9 assists for 30 points. Montreal's Odie Cleghorn in his first NHL season is runner-up in the scoring race on the strength of his 23 goals and 29 overall points. Ottawa's Clint Benedict leads the NHL in wins with 12 and goals against average with 2.94. Joe Hall, the Canadiens' big bad defenseman, leads the league in penalty minutes with 85. In the rival PCHA, the Portland franchise suspends operations while Lester Patrick's Victoria Aristocrats resume play. The PCHA adopts a deferred penalty rule, ensuring 6 men and a goalie on the ice at all times. Vancouver wins the PCHL regular season title and Cyclone Taylor leads in goals with 23. Seattle's Cully Wilson, a known tough guy, breaks the jaw of Vancouver's Mickey McKay, squelching the Millionaires' playoff hopes. The Seattle Metropolitans, with Hap Holmes in goal, take the PCHA title and earn the right to face the NHL champion. The NHL playoff between Montreal and Ottawa is a best-of-7 series. The Habs win 4-1, with Newsy Lalonde scoring 5 goals in 1 game. They'll face Seattle for the Stanley Cup. Seattle wins games 1 and 3 of the Cup Series 7-0 and 7-2, but Montreal wins Game 4 4-2. Seattle wins games 1 and 3 of the Cup Series 7-0 and 7-2, but Montreal wins Game 2 4-2. Goalies Vezina from Montreal and Holmes from Seattle pitch shutouts for 80 minutes in Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final. The game is declared a 0-0 draw. The 5th game of the Stanley Cup Final sees the Canadiens win 4-3 on Jack McDonald's overtime goal. The series is tied 2-1. In the middle of Game 5, Montreal's Joe Hall is taken to the hospital, sick with the influenza that is plaguing the nation. Before the Stanley Cup can be decided with the 6th game, many players from both teams are hospitalized with influenza. On April the 1st of 1919, the playoffs are canceled for the only time in its history the Stanley Cup is not awarded. On April the 5th of 1919, less than a week after falling sick, Joe Hall dies. Harry Hap Holmes made his Seattle teammates very happy during the 1918-1919 season, leading all PCHA goaltenders with a 2.30 goals against average. Holmes, an NHL goalie a year earlier, wore the distinctive Seattle jersey with pride. Hap helped the Mets defeat Vancouver in the 1919 playoffs, allowing only 2 goals in 2 games. He also went mano-a-mano with George Vezina in Game 4 of the Cup Finals, as each pitched shutouts for 80 minutes. One of the roughest players to ever lace up the skates, Odie Cleghorn, had his finest season in 1918-1919, scoring 23 goals for the Montreal Canadiens. Cleghorn didn't let up in the postseason, scoring 7 times against Ottawa in the NHL playoffs and scoring 2 more against Seattle in the Stanley Cup Finals. Odie and brother Sprague, both products of rough neighborhood, were once described as a disgrace to the game by referee Lou Marsh. Goalie Clint Benedict, playing for Ottawa in 1918-19, led the NHL in both victories with 12 and goals against average at 2.94. It was a huge turnaround for Benedict, who a year earlier had posted a league-worst 5.18 goals against average for Ottawa. The turnaround proved permanent as Benedict would go on to lead NHL in goals against for 5 straight years. Hall of Fame defenseman Sprague Cleghorn and Eddie Girard helped Clint keep the puck out of the net. The hockey world lost one of its greatest stars when Pennsylvania native Hobart Hobie Baker was killed in France while testing a fighter plane on December the 21st of 1918. Baker had retained his amateur status throughout his career, refusing all offers to turn pro. Renowned for his stick-handling, skating, and on-ice leadership, Baker led St. Nicholas to the Ross Cup in 1914 and Princeton to 2 intercollegiate titles. He was 27 when he died. After leading the NHL in scoring in 1918-1919 with a total of 30 points, the Canadiens' Newsy Lalonde exploded for 5 goals in one playoff game against Ottawa. Over the course of Lalonde's checkered career, he played for teams in Cornwall, Portage, Toronto, Montreal, Renfrew, Vancouver, Saskatoon, and New York. Despite the heavy traveling, he is regarded by many as the finest hockey player of the first quarter of the century. If the NHL was to survive its postnatal crisis, it would require mass public acceptance. In the wake of the notorious Black Sox scandal, Major League Baseball thrived because of the emergence of Babe Ruth as a national hero in the early 20s. At almost the same time, the National Hockey League was blessed with the hero of its own, Joe Malone. Like Ruth, Malone had established his roots in the previous decade, starring for the Quebec Bulldogs in the National Hockey Association. When Quebec suspended its operation, the strikingly handsome Malone was acquired by the Montreal Canadiens, for whom he scored 44 goals in 20 games in 1917-18. Malone survived the influenza epidemic and would have re-signed with the Canadiens after the 1918-1919 season. However, the Bulldogs rejoined the NHL in 1919-20 and reclaimed Malone, along with other former Quebec players such as Harry Mummery, Jack McDonald, and Tom Smith. Quebec iced a dreadful team in 1919-20, going 4-20 and coughing up nearly twice as many goals as it scored. But Malone performed nobly, virtually carrying the Bulldogs on his shoulders. Skating against the Toronto St. Patrick's one night, Malone scored an astonishing 7 goals, an NHL record that has never been equaled. Malone's scoring prowess inspired headlines across Canada and provided the 3-year-old league with a superstar on which to pin its publicity. Many observers consider Malone the greatest natural goal scorer ever. He might have been the most prolific scorer of all time if they had played more games in those days, said Frank Selke Jr., the former Canadiens manager who remembered Malone as a young professional. It was amazing the way Joe used to get himself in position to score. In that respect, his style was similar to Gordie Howe's. Joe was no Howie Morenz as far as speed was concerned, but he was a clean player like Dave Cone. On the other hand, Joe never took a backward step from anybody. Malone's deft play won him the nickname Phantom Joe. Wrote historian Charles Coleman, Malone was a tricky stick handler, deceptive skater, and always a clean, sportsmanlike player. He stood out in an era that was featured by rough play. Naturally, Malone never obtained as much media ballyhoo as Ruth garnered for his baseball exploits. For all his skills, Joe lacked the Babe's bombast and Ruth's proclivity for permissiveness. And of course, baseball was a more established and more popular sport at the time. But just as Ruth had the knack for delivering baseball's most exciting moment, the home run, so Malone manufactured the most galvanic feat in hockey, the big goal. In 1919-1920, he won his second scoring title in 3 years, tallying 39 red ones and 45 points. He punctuated his performance with a 6-goal performance against Ottawa on the final night of the season. As the newsman observed, imagine what Joe Malone would have done if he had played for a good team. The dormant Quebec Bulldogs finally become operational, thus expanding the NHL to 4 teams. The Toronto Arenas changed their nickname to the St. Patrick's. On January the 10th of 1920, Canadiens center Newsy Lalonde scores 6 times against Toronto to help Montreal to a 14-7 victory. The 21 goals set an NHL record that will remain untouched for 66 years. On January 31st, 1920, Quebec's Joe Malone set the all-time NHL record for goals in a game when he net 7 against Toronto in a 10-6 game. On February the 21st, the St. Pats host the Ottawa Senators before a record crowd of 8,500, a sign of good things to come for the NHL. On March 3rd, 1920, the Canadiens humiliate Quebec 16-3, setting the all-time NHL record for goals in a game. On March 6, 1920, Toronto St. Pat's winger Mickey Roach knocks 5 goals past Quebec goalie Frank Brophy en route to an 11-2 win. On March 10, 1920, Joe Malone scores 6 goals against Ottawa. Quebec wins 10-4. Ottawa's record of 19-5 is good enough for the first regular season title. Quebec goes 4-20, yielding an all-time NHL record 7.38 goals against per game. Quebec center Joe Malone captures the scoring title with 39 goals and 48 points in just 24 games. Hot on Malone's heels in the scoring race is Newsy Lalonde, who finishes the season with 36 goals and 42 points. Playmaker Corb Dennehy of the Toronto St. Patrick's leads the NHL in assists with 12. The Canadian Olympic team made its first international appearance at the 1920 Olympic Games in Antwerp, Belgium. Ice hockey made its Olympic debut at these games, and the Canadian side was represented by the Winnipeg Falcons, winners of the Allen Cup in 1920, managed by W.A. Hewitt and featuring Frank Frederickson. Canada won all 3 of its games by a combined score of 29-1. Lester Patrick continued to patrol the blue line for the Victoria Cougars in 1919-1920. Patrick, whose innovations include the blue lines, jersey numbers, and the modern arena, scored 2 goals on the year. He may not have been a scoring champ, but he played for, coached, managed, and owned the team. As the head of the PCHA, he also okayed the use of adding ringer Bernie Morris of the Seattle lineup when the Mets played Ottawa in the Stanley Cup Finals. The Stanley Cup had once been the trophy awarded exclusively to Canadian amateur teams, but with professionals now skating for the mug, a new trophy needed to be forged for the amateurs. The Memorial Cup, which debuted in 1919-1920, would be contested by amateur junior teams in Canada. Impressively, the cup is still a coveted prize today. The very first Memorial Cup was won by the Toronto Canoe Club, which was apparently as slick on the ice as it was on the water. Frank Foyston was no stranger to success, a member of the 1914 Stanley Cup champion Toronto Blue Shirts and the 1917 champion Seattle Metropolitans. Foyston was an established star. In 1919-1920, however, he finally accomplished the one feat that had eluded his grasp as he won the PCHA scoring title for the first time with 26 goals. He also notched 3 double-goal games in the Cup Finals, although the Mets fell to Ottawa in 5 games. Jack Dara played his entire career in his hometown of Ottawa. Known for his smooth stride and mechanical style of play, he was one of the dominant players of his day. In 1919-1920, he scored a respectable 22 goals in 22 games for the Senators. He topped off the season with a Stanley Cup championship, scoring 3 goals in the decisive Game 5 of the finals. 4 years later, at the age of 34, Dara died of a sudden heart attack. Toronto's Cully Wilson, a rugged right winger who was banned from the PCHA for his aggressive play, leads the NHL with 79 penalty minutes. Ottawa's Clint Benedict leads the NHL in wins with 19 and goals against average at 2.67. He's the only goalie in the league to record any shutouts and has 5. Because the Senators win both halves of the season's split schedule, there are no NHL playoffs. Seattle wins the PCHA's regular season title and then knocks off Vancouver in the playoffs. Seattle will thus meet Ottawa in the Stanley Cup Finals. Seattle is aided in the finals by a ringer as the Mets lure winger Bernie Morris out of retirement and insert him into the lineup. Because their color scheme too closely resembles Seattle's colors, the Senators agree to switch to white sweaters for the finals. Ottawa takes Game 1 of the finals 3-2 as Jack Dara scores the winner with 4 minutes to go. In Game 2, Ottawa's Clint Benedict records a shutout and Jack Dara notches another game-winning goal as the Senators win 3-0. Playing by NHL rules in Game 3, Seattle scores a 3-1 victory. Frank Foyston notches his third 2-goal game in the finals in Game 4 as Seattle wins 5-2 to tie the series. Jack Dara scores a hat-trick in Game 5 of the finals as Ottawa wins 6-1 and claims the Stanley Cup. In amateur competition, the first Memorial Cup, which will come to symbolize excellence in Canadian junior hockey, is captured by the Toronto Canoe Club. Ice hockey debuts in the Olympics at the Summer Games, and Canada emerges with the gold medal. Any talk of early hockey dynasties usually centers around the Canadian capital. The Ottawa Silver Seven captured 4 straight Stanley Cups after the turn of the century, and in the years surrounding 1920, the Ottawa Senators staked their claim as the NHL's first dynasty. In 1918-19, the Senators posted a league-best 12-6 record. A year later, they finished atop the NHL once more with a 19-5 mark and subsequently demolished Seattle in the Stanley Cup Finals. Ottawa's domination was based on shrewd management and a rich talent source in the nearby Ottawa Valley, which sent many a star to the NHL. During the 1920-21 season, Ottawa featured an enviable lineup. Clint Benedict reigned as the league's finest goaltender, and such forwards as Cy Dennehy, Jack Dara, and Frank Niebor ranked among the world's best. Eddie Garrard and Sprague Cleghorn were acclaimed as 2 of the top defensemen of their day. Dennehy was one of the best left wingers in the NHL's first epoch, a rough and tumble player despite his small stature. Dennehy was sometimes cast into the enforcer's role when looking out for smaller, mild-mannered line mates. The rugged Harry Broadbent was a tough cop on the beat as well, and when the duo was paired together, they were gleefully referred to as the Gold Dust Twins by the delirious Senator Faithful. Dara was a steady, unspectacular, and unselfish player who skated in Ottawa for 13 seasons. Though never a big star, Jack tallied amazingly consistent goal totals and frequently came up big in the playoffs. Gerard was one of the NHL's most versatile players, skating on defense or at forward with equal brilliance. Cleghorn was as tough as they came. He was a product of a rough neighborhood, said the late Bobby Hewitson, where everything you got you had to fight for. And he played hockey the same way. During the 1920-21 season, the Senators immediately asserted their strength in an impressive manner, winning their first 5 games. They finished in second place at 14-10-0, but knocked off first place Toronto in the playoffs. Ottawa's Benedict blanked Toronto twice, qualifying the Senators for the Stanley Cup, which they would defend against the Vancouver Millionaires. The best-of-5 series would prove a litmus test over Ottawa's dynastic claims. Undaunted by the Senators' reputation, the Millionaires played Ottawa even through 4 games, 3 of which were decided by just one single goal. The climactic 5th game was played in front of a hostile Vancouver audience, but the Senators rallied from 1-0 first-period deficit to tie the count in the second. Then, just minutes later, Dennehy sent a pass to Dara, who converted it for the winning goal. Ottawa thus won its 8th Stanley Cup, including 2 out of the 4 since the NHL was organized. A year later, Ottawa led the NHL with a 14-8-2 mark. Few could dispute the Senators' claim to dynastic status. The Quebec Bulldogs are sold to Percy Thompson of Hamilton, Ontario. Prior to the start of the season, their name is changed to the Hamilton Tigers. On December 22nd, Hamilton pounds Montreal 5-0 as Babe Dye scores a pair of goals against Georges Vezina. Toronto immediately reclaims Babe Dye from Hamilton after his scoring outburst. They instead send Mickey Roach to the Tigers. In Hamilton, the Tigers finish last in the league with a 6-18 record. Ottawa's 8-2 record wins them the first half title, while the Toronto St. Pats earn a playoff berth with a 10-4 record over the second half. On January 26, 1921, Corbett Dennehy, Toronto's top left winger, nets 6 goals against Hamilton. Not to be outdone by his brother Cy Dennehy, Ottawa's leading scorer scores 6 goals against Hamilton on March 7, 1921. Montreal's Newsy Lalonde scores 5 times in a 10-5 St. Patrick's Day rout of the Tigers. Though he's just 3rd in goals with 33 and 4th overall in assists with 8, Newsy Lalonde takes the scoring title with 41 total points. Toronto's Babe Dye wins the goal-scoring title with 35. Ottawa's Cy Dennehy finishes 2nd in the NHL in goals with 34 and points with 39. Harry Cameron proved he was the finest defenseman in the NHL during the 1920-21 season as he netted a healthy 18 goals for the Toronto St. Patricks. A rough competitor who came from the St. Pats from the Montreal Canadiens, Cameron's fierce presence along the blue line vaulted the Pats in the first-place finish. Cameron was one of the first NHL players to curve his shots without altering the blade of his stick. Once again, Lalonde leads in scoring. In 1920-21, the Canadiens' Newsy Lalonde enjoyed another goal-happy season. In the 24 regular season games, he scored 33 goals and added 8 assists for a league-leading 41 points. This was the second time Lalonde captured the scoring title, having won the prize in 1919. This was also the last big NHL season for the aging vet. After a poor 1921-22 campaign, he was traded to Saskatoon of the WCHL for RL Joliet. Babe Dye had every excuse for a bad year in 1920-21. His Toronto squad traded him to Hamilton early in the season, and after one game, he was bounced back to Hogtown. The uncertainty should have rattled the young scoring ace, but he was at his finest ever, scoring in Toronto in 11 straight games and leading the NHL with 35 goals in 24 games. Purely a goal scorer, Dye recorded just 2 assists on the year, fewest ever for a 30-goal scorer. On March 4th of 1921, the Victoria Aristocrats held a Moose Johnson night, honoring their veteran defenseman. Johnson, who won 4 Stanley Cups with the Montreal Wanderers in the early 1900s, played on several teams until his retirement in 1922. Moose was a big man who also used a big stick. The combination gave him a reach of 99 inches, reputedly the longest in hockey. When Johnson retired, his stick was given a proper burial. Clint Benedict once again is stalwart in goal for Ottawa, leading the NHL in wins with 14 in goals against, 3.13 for the second straight year. In a 2-game total goals playoff matchup, Ottawa cruises past Toronto 5-0 and 2-0. Goalie Clint Benedict stars for the Senators. In the PCHA, the Vancouver Millionaires are back atop the regular season standings, edging Seattle by a half game. On March 4th of 1921, Seattle and Victoria play a triple overtime 4-4 tie as Victoria's Moose Johnson is honored. Vancouver and Seattle meet in a one-sided playoff as the Millionaires trounced the rivals 13-2 over 2 games. In Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals, 11,000 fans packed Vancouver's arena to watch the Millionaires beat Ottawa 2-1. The Senators win Game 2 of the finals as Punch Broadbent breaks a 3-3 tie with less than 4 minutes to play. Ottawa wins Game 3 3-2 as roughhouse defenseman Spray Cleghorn scores the winner. Vancouver's Alf Skinner scores twice as Bill Cook knocks home the game-winning goal as the Millionaires take Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Finals 3-2. Alf Skinner stakes Vancouver to a 1-0 early lead in Game 5, but Jack Dara, a hero of the 1919-1920 playoffs, scores the tying and winning goals to help Ottawa win its second straight Stanley Cup. Jack Dara leads all playoff competitors in goals with 5 and points with 5, while teammate Clint Benedict posts a 1.71 playoff goals against average. I'm Charlie Saunier from the Renegades of Puck, and this has been the 20th Century Hockey Chronicle. If you'd like to support more projects like this, please follow the Renegades of Puck on all social media platforms and also visit renegadesofpuck.com.